and welcome to our second evening. Our reflection will be offered by Father Dennis Gallagher. Many of you know him. He lives in Worcester at Assumption University, and he is the Vice President for Mission at the university. We thank him for stepping up. As we said last night, this was supposed to be done by Marc, LePain, and Father Dennis accepted to do it. He is following in the footsteps of Marc and help us reflect on what it means to confess in the footsteps of St. Augustine. It is my hope that our reflection tonight will help us prepare for tomorrow as we end up with Sacrament of Reconciliation. Please welcome Father Dennis.
Thank you, Sal. For those of you who know baseball, I feel like a utility infielder. Brought up from the minor leagues, actually. I might have been playing in A-ball, they call it A-ball, maybe even in the instructional league, but anyway, they brought me up here so give me a break, all right? Just a little time to prepare what I have to say tonight. But I am happy to be here. And I know Marc. I don't know what Marc was going to say. I just know the title of his. What does it mean for Augustine to confess? So I'm not assuming anything, but I know what Marc is going to say. But I'll just try to give some kind of thought, a few kind of thoughts that might be helpful in response to that question. So what does it mean to confess? The most famous work of Augustine has the title of the Confessions. Many of you have had a chance to read the Confessions over the course of your lives. So that in the case at hand, with this book called The Confessions, the question is, what does Augustine mean by confessions, as he gives that title to this work, this extraordinary work. Popular notion, perfectly true notion, is that confession involves the confession of one's sins. As such, we might be tempted to compare Augustine's confessions with some of the sort of tell-all autobiographies that can come rolling off the press these days, where we have a certain attraction to things that are a bit salacious. We're attracted to, especially when it involves somebody important, some great figure. And so according to this notion, confessions has to do principally with Augustine's sowing his wild oats, as we say. More politely, we might say his youthful indiscretions. And eventually finding God and turning his life around. I think it's fair to say that this is one of the reasons why, one of the great reasons why the Confessions is, by St. Augustine himself, and the Confessions are attractive to a lot of people. But to say that this gives a full account of what Augustine means by confession, is to settle on something that I think is pretty wide of the mark as far as the deepest meaning of that. This is what I'm going to try to elaborate a little bit on this evening. Again, it's true that what we usually mean by confession is certainly the most common use of the term, And Augustine does give us some of that, but actually rather discreetly. He's less interested, I think, in exposing us to the details of his early disordered life than he is in shedding light on those divisions and conflicts within himself, we could say within ourselves, which give rise to our various kinds of sinfulness. So he's interested in understanding himself as clearly as possible. The fact that the one actual sin to which he gives most extended attention in the Confessions is the stealing of some pears with his boyhood pals. I don't know if you're familiar with that scene in the Confessions. He describes, it's simply told, a bunch of his pals get together and there's some pears that are in the neighboring, over in the neighbor's house, and they went over and they just stole pears. And he comments that there was no real benefit that was going to come from stealing these pears. I mean, there was minimal pleasure in them, and kind of momentary thrill, if you want, but nothing that really, would be able to explain why it was that they would do this sort of thing. And so Augustine asks himself, why did he join in stealing these pears when there was no real benefit to be derived from them? So this tells us that his interest lies someplace other than salacious, sins. So he's interested in knowing what's the source of those irrational impulses within ourselves that defy any kind of reasonable explanation, that cause us to do things that we don't want to do and certainly don't have to do. Now, from the age of 19, Augustine tells us this in the Confessions. From the age of 19, as a result of reading a book, actually, Augustine became a lover of truth, a pursuer of the truth. So he wasn't a fly-by-night guy. He was a serious guy, early, even in those less than fully ordered early years of his life. He's pursuing the truth, and that truth is not an abstract truth. Sometimes if you hear truth, you think of something abstract that's entirely sort of remote from us. That's not the kind of truth Augustine was certainly capable of pursuing philosophical truth. But for him, the truth meant the truth about himself, that is to say, what was going to be the deepest truth about himself, because this would have everything to do with how he was going to live his life. That's why the truth mattered to him, because it was going to help him understand how he should live his life, and what he called, the expression that Augustine is fond of using, how he would order his loves. The ordering of love. That's if you want a sort of quick definition of what happiness is for St. Augustine, it means having one's loves in the proper order, in the right order. If you think about that, in other words, what he meant by it is that some things are more worthy of our love than other things. They are intrinsically, in and of themselves, they are more worthy of love than other things. What happens to us frequently enough is that we end up investing our lives in things which, objects if you want, or activities, pleasures, that are incapable of providing the deepest satisfaction of our hearts and our souls. And that's what Augustine was experiencing in his own life. And if you think about that, who is it that's most completely and absolutely worthy of our love? Well, it's God. So for Augustine, the love of God has to be in first place. And if the love of God is in first place, we see this in the scriptures itself. If the love of God is first in our lives, then other things will fall into place. We'll be able to order our lives properly, and that would bring us into harmony with ourselves, into harmony with one another, and into harmony with God. So there's a lot at stake then in Jefferson's pursuing this truth. How is it that he's going to be able to find this deep happiness that his heart craved? That this encounter with the truth about himself was a source of considerable anguish is no more evident than in some passages in book 8 of the Confessions. Book 8 is about halfway through the Confessions. It's a time right before he actually experiences his conversion. These are such remarkable passages. I'd like to read a couple of them too, just to give you a sense for but I guess what I would call the drama. It's the drama of a human soul as it is gathered about by various kinds of desires and is pulled in a certain direction, but can't quite get to where it is it wants to go. Just to put that somewhat inadequately, but just 2 paragraphs here I would read, give you a sense. Try to get a sense of the images that he uses in these passages. Augustine writes, again, this is right when he's just about on the verge of his conversion. He says, I was thus weighed down by the pleasant burden of the world, and the way one commonly is by sleep. And the thoughts with which I attempted to meditate upon you, God, were like the efforts of people who are trying to wake up, but are overpowered and immersed once more in slumberous deeps. No one wants to be asleep all the time, and it is generally agreed among sensible people that being awake is a better state. Yet it often happens that a person puts off the moment when he must shake himself out of sleep because his limbs are heavy with a lassitude that pulls him toward the more attractive alternative, even though he is already trying to resist it, and the hour for rising has come. In a similar way, I was quite sure that surrendering myself to your love would be better than succumbing to my lust. But while the former course commended itself and was beginning to conquer, the latter charmed and chained me. I had no answer to give it, as you said to me, arise, sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will enlighten you. And plied me with evidence that you spoke truly. No, I was convinced by the truth and had no answer whatever except the sluggish, drowsy words. Just a minute. One more minute. Let me have a little longer. But these minutes never diminished, and my little longer lasted inordinately long. To find my delight in your law, as far as my inmost self was concerned, was of no profit to me, when a different law in my bodily members was warring against the law of my mind, imprisoning me under the law of sin, which held sway in my lower self. For the law of sin is that brute force of habit, whereby the mind is dragged along and held fast against its will, and deservedly so, because it slipped into the habit willingly. In my wretched state, who was there to free me from this death-doomed body, save your grace through Jesus Christ our Lord. One more passage. Not as long. Such, this a little bit later, such was the sickness of which I agonized, blaming myself more sharply than ever, turning and twisting in my chain as I strove to tear free from it completely. For slender indeed was the bond that still held me. But hold me it did. In my secret heart you stood by me, Lord, redoubling the lashes of fear and shame in the severity of your mercy. Lest I give up the struggle, and that slender, fragile bond that remained be not broken after all, but thicken again and constrict me more tightly. Let it be now, I was saying to myself. Now is the moment, let it be now. And merely by saying this, I was moving toward the decision. I would almost achieve it, but then fall back just short. Yet I didn't slip right down to my starting point, but stood aside to get my breath back. Then I would make a fresh attempt, and now I was almost there. I was touching the goal, grasping it, and then I was not there. Not touching, not grasping it. I shrank from dying to death and living to life. For ingrained evil was more powerful in me than new-crafted good. The nearer it came, that moment when I would be changed, the more it pierced me with terror. Dismayed but not quite dislodged, I was left hanging. Probably say it's good. It's a good thing that he finally surrendered. But those are as I should say as moving and as insightful, psychologically acute descriptions of a soul that is, in great distress as it begins to move towards the good and away from the evil. Augustine's efforts, his gargantuan efforts at self-understanding, situates itself within, I think, a larger meaning of the word confessions, which is to confess the lines of God's action in Augustine's life and to confess the lines of God's action in our own lives. Notice it's not the confession of sin. This is the confession of how God is at work in drawing us closer to himself. So confession here is again places God's initiative in first place. At the heart of Augustine's conversion, which takes place shortly after these passages that I just read, the point at which the whole of his life was turned, and he anticipates that in these passages that we just heard. The point at which the whole of his life was turned was that for all of his efforts to lift himself up to God, whether it be by his, prodigious intellectual abilities, or by the force of his will, it remained for him, this is the only thing which made his conversion possible, it remained for him to accept with great humility the truth that it was God, in God's great mercy, who came down to him. It wasn't a question of lifting himself up to God. That was going to be of no avail, proved to be of no avail. What was of avail was that God chose to come down to him, and that this was to be for him the source of his healing, the restoration of his conflicted and divided self. In this, Augustine shows us the proper orientation of our lives as Christians, which always begins with a recognition of what God has done for us by taking our very flesh and dying for us. In other words, it starts from the recognition that God has accomplished for us something which we could not possibly have brought about for ourselves. That we are not and never in a position to simply make ourselves right before God. Because that's what it means to try to lift ourselves up to God. Our situation is always to be recipients, grateful recipients of a God who bends down and touches our lives in the person of his Son, and whose love goes to the very limit, goes to the very cross, out of love for us. One of my, I think I may have mentioned this before on a few occasions, but the quotation on my ordination leaflet when I was ordained many years back was a quotation from the Confessions, which was, all of my hope is nowhere except in your mercy, O Lord. All of my hope is nowhere except in your mercy, O Lord. I believed that when I was 29 years old, and before that, I think, but as you live out your life, if I can speak for myself, that has borne itself true. In never repeated ways. All of my hope is nowhere except in your great mercy. Another kind of related quote from the Confessions, which I've always appreciated. I'm sorry, I don't have a particular book or verse right here, but is left to ourselves, Augustine says, left to ourselves, we are the surest guides to our own destruction. Left to ourselves, we are the surest guides to our own destruction. So that's I mean, to suggest, what's at stake in our receiving the help which we can't give ourselves, the saving help of our Word. The only appropriate response to what God has done for us is praise and thanksgiving. And this is also, I think, the deepest meaning of this great work, the Confessions. It is a confession of praise and thanksgiving. Say praise first. Praise to God for what he has accomplished in his servant Augustine, and desires to accomplish in all of us. From the time of his baptism and his conversion and baptism, Augustine entrusted himself to God. Just underline that word, entrust. To entrust. I think this is true for every Christian vocation. There is a fundamental kind of entrusting that takes place. We entrust ourselves, in each case to God, to be sure, but in marriage we entrust ourselves to our spouse, to our children. For us in religious life, we entrust ourselves to the brothers and the sisters in the community. What does that suggest? To entrust, it means a kind of permanence in a certain way that says, in effect, that, I will be with you without knowing what that really entails in any specific kind trust is. So Augustine entrusts himself to God. Contained in that act of entrusting was the lived out truth that his life was not his own. His life was not his own. And this is true for all of us who call ourselves Christians. We are called, I think, all of us, to echo St. Paul's great affirmation that this is true because of our baptism. That it is not I, it is not, Paul says, it is not I, it is no longer I who live, it is Christ Jesus who lives in me. Again, that's the depth of the Christian mystery. We think about our relationship with Christ. We could say, do we live for Christ? Well, in a certain sense, yes, but that's not really an adequate way of describing our relationship. Do we live with Christ? That's better. That's a better way of understanding it because it suggests, that we're walking together. There's an accompaniment there, which is very much part of the Christian life. But the deepest little preposition for all of this is that we live in Christ. We actually live in Christ. That's the depth of the Christian mystery. Christ lives within us. And Augustine, it's part of the trusting of himself to God was the conviction that was the case. Okay. So I was going to say with regard to the various Christian vocations that, we know, through experience, all of us know what is required of us to really take that entrusting seriously. And it always involves some experience of the cross, because we entrust ourselves to God. How is it that we're going to grow closer to God? Only through some experience of suffering. Just a few, more or less, I don't think they're random, but it's more other thoughts related to this. I think in this regard, for a mission like this, maybe, I don't know whether this means anything to you, but maybe it would be helpful during the course of this week to make an inventory. I call it an inventory of your own life. Step back a bit, take a look at the whole of it, and try to identify the traces of God's action in your life. And I would, if you're willing to do that, I would warn you against one possible fallacy, I guess, in doing it, is that you would only identify what you see as the good things in your life with God, and you basically don't look seriously at the things that have been really, really painful and difficult in your life, because we know the expression God writes with crooked lines. God's providence in our lives is not necessarily evident, in the immediate, moment when we're experiencing either joys or difficulties. Difficulties are more challenging. But the importance of perhaps the value of the inventory would be to help you, to help us to see that there are some moments of real suffering and maybe even real sinfulness in our lives that are, in retrospect, the ways in which God manages to somehow draw us closer to Himself. So that's, I would just invite you to think about that. The one thing. I think I'd also like to make reference to something else that St. Paul makes clear. I think he speaks this way. Anyway, let me just speak about the early Christians. The early Christians understood themselves as a Eucharistic community. That's how they referred to themselves. Now that included them gathering together to break bread together, to celebrate what we call Eucharist together. But it meant something much more sort of wider than that, or more fundamental than this particular action that they're doing. This is something St. Paul says, that our whole life is a thanksgiving offering to God. Remember I said that the only appropriate response to what God has done for us is praise and thanksgiving. And that praise and thanksgiving is not simply a kind of, rah, 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 good God. The praise and thanksgiving especially, is the manner of our life. The manner of our life which itself bears witness to what God has done for us. And then we can speak of that as a thanksgiving. That our life in its entirety is a thanksgiving offering to God. G.K. Chesterton, the great Catholic writer of the 20th century, one of his books on, I think it was the biographies, St. Francis of Assisi, was just commenting on the whole variety of saints that there are in the church, all sorts of different types of saints. But he ventured to say that the one thing that all the saints have in common is that their lives arose, the quality of their lives arose out of a wellspring of thanksgiving. That's the one thing he said that the saints have in common, that they understood their lives as a response, very concretely, to the love of God and what God had done for them. Okay, one thought also about the creed that we recite at Mass every Sunday. We call that the confession of faith. My sense about the creed is it's maybe the one thing in the Mass that we're most likely to kind of do in a very rote kind of way. It's like, okay, I believe in God, blah, blah, blah. I don't presume that's the case with you, but I think that's, partly because it's a bit abstract. It's theological, of course. It's a straight out expression of the theological truths of the church. But again, I guess I would encourage you to maybe make an effort, not if it is the case that you tend to do it by rote. I speak to myself here. Make an effort to pay attention. Don't read. Hopefully, the community doesn't read it so fast that you can't really pay attention. I know some have offered the opinion that we should sing the creed. We should sing it because the singing of it more likely draw our attention to its importance as well as help us to concentrate more on the reality of it, because this is the body of truth that we together we hold, and there's nothing unimportant about that. My last couple of words here would be this. Just a word about, we're in the middle of Lent at this point, moving towards the latter part of Lent, I guess. But I think that what I've suggested tonight does have some implications as to how it is the spirit in which we observe the season of Lent. What do I mean by that? Well, Lent is not intended to be a self-improvement program. Sometimes we can get into that kind of frame of mind, that we're going to do things, resolve to do things that are going to make us. I want to be careful as to how to state this, because I don't want to dismiss the efforts that people make, but the spirit in which they do it is not so much to make ourselves better, as much as is to, well, what are we doing at Lent? What are we doing? We're preparing ourselves for Easter. Lent is a preparation for the greatest gift that God has given us, His resurrection from the dead, His overcoming the power of sin and death. And what we do during Lent, the sacrifices that we make, the things that we give up, whatever practices we have resolved to do, I think are intended to make room for God, to clear up space within ourselves, to free us from those attachments that prevent us from experiencing the fullness of joy of Easter, because we're still to use the images from Augustine's earlier text, we're still a bit asleep, we're still in slumber, and if there's anything that should cause us to be alive, it's the celebration of the truth of the resurrection and the truth of Easter. This is what in John's Gospel says that Jesus came into the world to give us life, and life to the full. So that's why at the beginning of Lent, I think the readings tell us we shouldn't have gloomy faces as we undergo these exercises that we do, because they really are all intended to open us up more freely and more generously to the grace of God. So, how is it that we can really allow God's life and love to take hold in us? We may seem to have wandered a little bit far from confession here, but I think the things I mentioned at the end here are really follow from understanding, again, the truth of what Augustine means by confessing that we have been, again, we have been the beneficiaries of something that we could not possibly give to ourselves, and we can only stand in grateful awe to a God who loves us in that way. So I think that's what I want to say. Thank you.
A few minutes for questions and answers. Feel free.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned about actually praying the creed during Mass and not doing it by rote or doing so quickly that you're not even aware of what you're praying. So would you have any recommendations or suggestions on how a community like St. Anne's would implement that?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that.
You mentioned about the creed.
Yes.
And that too often we can get into the habit of just praying it by rote, not being aware of what we're saying. You mentioned that maybe singing would be a good thing. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on how a parish like St. Anne, St. Patrick's could implement that at the Sunday Mass?
Well, you wouldn't be the first parish to do it. I mean, I remember going to St. Paul's in Cambridge back in the day, and they always sang the creed. I think I've been in other places. So there are what do they call those arrangements for singing the creed. I don't that would be one thing. But I think a regular reminder on the part of the presider of the Mass that we're not just going to go through the motions with this. Let's maybe, I think, slowing it down. Really intentionally slowing it down. Sometimes you have this the gospel that has the Lord's Prayer, and that's the one Sunday where the priest might say, okay, let's read this prayer. We're going to pray this more slowly. Well, why not try to do that every week? So slowing it down, singing. I don't know. Is that something that's in the? If that's in the cards there.
Liz, is in the cards?
The point of it is to, we're not talking about aesthetics here, we're talking about, how to do it in a prayerful way. So I think slowing down and being reminded of it, at least on occasion would help. So,
Thank you.
Yes, Paul Henry.
I've thought for some time that one way of looking at the confessions is St. Augustine, it's almost a commentary on St. Paul in many ways. And I was really impressed with that first quotation. Most of that quotation is St. Paul. And yet he incorporates it into his description of his own life. It begins with St. Paul, right at the beginning. And then, of course, the conversion scene, he's reading St. Paul. So I don't know if there's any, you've surely seen that, I think.
Yes, I think so. I think most of those sort of connections I try to make at the end, almost all of them have to do with somehow with St. Paul. So,
It's almost as if he's giving some kind of flesh to Paul's theology, saying this is the way it works out in experience.
What's the hierarchy there? Is it
Hierarchy is about the highest.
Yes.
There's some loves he starts, and some loves he keeps.
Yes. Yeah. Any addict, for example, would tell you that, I'm not saying Augustine's an addict, but any addict would tell you that the sorrow that they, the ones who have come clean will tell you that the sorrow they experienced was that they were investing so much of themselves into something which could.
I was thinking about it. His love is love. His love.
Well, that's part of the hierarchy.
His love is he keeps.
Human love, family love is going to be pretty high on the hierarchy. Yes, sir. Again.
I'm sorry. So most of us couldn't hear what Steve Maxson asked. Could you kind of restate what he said or asked, and then what?
Well, we say yes. The love of God is at the top of the hierarchy as far as the ordering of loves is concerned. But then I think he was looking for, okay, well, how do you measure the scale from lowest to up towards the highest? And he was saying that love of your mother or love of your family is. I think he said he was thinking about that. That's going to be love of God's creatures. They're human, created in His image. In His image, that's going to be, very high. But again, that kind of love can itself be disordered if it's not oriented toward God. Right? So I think that's what he's saying.
So thank you, Father Dennis, for your reflection. On behalf of our parishioners, we want to say thank you for helping us to reflect with St. Augustine on what it means to confess. Please give an applause for the Dennis.
Can I make one last I was also going to suggest as a kind of take home in view of tomorrow. I mean, tomorrow Father Rogers is going to speak about, I guess we call it interiority, which I think I made Mr. Flynn. But maybe as you prepare for the sacrament of reconciliation, I don't insist upon this, but sometimes I invite people to, in advance, to not only do an examination of conscience, which includes their various sins that they would like to express sorrow for, but also to maybe include one or two things where you feel as though God has really been at work in your life, and you want to just affirm that. Maybe you don't have to even say that aloud. Go to the confession where that kind of maybe even helpful for that kind of preparation. That's all I'm saying.
If you missed last night's reflection, you can find it on Facebook from the parish page, and this talk also will be on Facebook. And we have coffee hand after this for those who would like to stay again and discuss and talk. Tomorrow, same time, same venue, maybe for 30 minutes reflection, and then a short reconciliation service with Father Chan